Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Dante. When I discovered my wife had been planning to divorce me and install her boyfriend in the house I paid for, it was the day the part of me I never knew came out. When I met Catherine 8 years ago, I was 43 and had been convinced I would never marry again after losing my first wife to an autoimmune disease that had taken her from me after many years of what I thought was an unbreakable partnership. My first wife's death had left me not just emotionally shattered, but also financially vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated, as medical bills and end-of-life care had consumed savings I thought were secure. After her funeral, I had made a conscious decision to focus entirely on rebuilding my business and financial security more than anything. I had spent years after my first wife's death working hours, expanding my commercial real estate business. My goal was never to become financially vulnerable again. But my family had other ideas about my self-imposed isolation. My family during those quiet years was quietly encouraging me to consider dating again, arguing that my first wife wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life alone, and that I was too young to give up on companionship and love. As more years went by, they pointed out that I had successfully rebuilt my finances and career, and that perhaps it was time to consider rebuilding my personal life as well. Their persistent encouragement eventually wore down my resistance, and I agreed to attend an event where my sister promised to introduce me to some single women she thought I might find interesting and compatible. I had no real expectations for the evening beyond satisfying my family's concerns about my social isolation and perhaps making some business connections that might be useful for my real estate ventures. Catherine, the woman my sister finally introduced me to, stood out immediately at that event, not just because she was strikingly beautiful, but because we seemed to vibe from the get-go. And she asked thoughtful questions about things that suggested she understood complex issues beyond surface-level small talk. At 27, Catherine carried herself with a sophistication and maturity that made the age difference feel less significant than it might have in other circumstances. She had a master's degree in communications and worked for a mid-size firm I know. Our courtship developed slowly and carefully over months after meeting, because I was determined not to make impulsive decisions about relationships that could bring back the pain I felt after losing my first wife. Catherine seemed to understand and respect my cautious approach, never pressuring me to move faster than I felt comfortable, and appearing genuinely interested in building something substantial rather than rushing into commitments neither of us was ready for. When Catherine and I married after 2 years of dating, I believed I had found someone with whom I could build a stable life together. Catherine had been supportive during the wedding planning process, respectful of my memories of my first wife, and enthusiastic about the life we would be creating as a couple. She moved into my house, which I renovated and paid off after my first wife's death. We gradually settled into routines that felt comfortable and sustainable. What Catherine didn't know, and what I didn't feel the need to explain in detail during our early years together, was that I had structured all of my significant assets through legal entities and trusts that protected them from potential creditors, lawsuits, and yes, divorce proceedings. The house we lived in was owned by an LLC that I controlled, but that wasn't directly tied to my personal name. My investment accounts, business interests, and other valuable assets were similarly protected through legal structures that my attorney had recommended after my first wife's death. These arrangements weren't designed to deceive Catherine or hide assets from her. They were standard business practices that any successful entrepreneur should implement to protect their wealth from the various risks that come with operating in the commercial world. If someone sued my business, if a tenant got injured on one of my properties, if any number of potential legal problems arose, my personal assets would be protected from claims that could otherwise wipe out everything I had worked to build. But these legal protections also meant that in the event of a divorce, Catherine's claims on my assets would be limited to whatever I had acquired during our marriage that wasn't protected by these existing structures. Since most of my wealth had been accumulated before we met, and since I had been careful to maintain the legal separation between my personal life and my business interests, Catherine's potential share of my assets would be significantly smaller than she might expect. For the first 4 years of our marriage, These financial arrangements were irrelevant because Catherine and I seemed to bond on a genuine partnership based on mutual love, respect, and shared goals. Catherine appeared to be happy with our lifestyle, which was comfortable. She never expressed dissatisfaction with anything. Catherine contributed to our household, though her salary was modest compared to my business income, and she seemed content to let me handle most of the financial planning and decision-making while she focused on her career and social activities. We traveled occasionally, entertained friends regularly, and maintained the kind of middle-class lifestyle that's appropriate for our combined circumstances. But around our 5th year of marriage, I began to notice changes in Catherine's behavior and attitudes that suggested she was becoming less satisfied with our life together and more interested in the lifestyle and social status that greater wealth could provide. Catherine started making comments about couples we knew who lived in larger houses, took more expensive vacations, or seemed to have access to luxuries that we didn't prioritize in our budget. Catherine also began spending more time with women who seemed to have different priorities and values around money and status than the friends we had socialized with during our early years together. These women were married to men in other high-income professions, and their conversations apparently focused heavily on shopping, expensive restaurants, luxury travel, and other activities that required significant disposable income. The influence of Catherine's new social circle became apparent in her increasing requests for budget adjustments that would allow for more spending on clothes, entertainment, and social activities. Catherine began arguing that we could afford more expensive lifestyle, and that my conservative approach to spending was unnecessarily limiting our enjoyment of life and preventing her from fully participating in the social activities that were important to her. These conversations about money became increasingly frequent and contentious as Catherine pushed for changes in our financial priorities that I wasn't comfortable making. Catherine seemed to believe that because my business was doing well, we should be spending more freely on luxuries and status symbols that would demonstrate our success to others. She couldn't understand why someone with my level of wealth would choose to live modestly when we could afford so much more. What troubled me most about these arguments wasn't Catherine's desire for a more expensive lifestyle, but her apparent belief that she was entitled to spend money I had earned through decades of work and sacrifice without contributing proportionally to our household income. Catherine seemed to view my assets as ours, forgetting that most of my wealth had been accumulated before our marriage and was the result of risks and sacrifices she had never shared. Catherine's spending demands were accompanied by other changes in her behavior that created distance between us and made me question her commitment to our marriage. She began staying out later with her friends, spending entire weekends on social activities that came with vague explanations, and generally treating our home as a place to sleep and change clothes rather than as the center of a shared life we were building together. Most concerning was Catherine's apparent loss of interest in the physical and emotional intimacy that had characterized our early years together. Catherine became increasingly distant and unaffectionate, claiming to be too tired or too busy with her social activities to spend quality time together or maintain the kind of connection that had brought us together in the first place. The combination of Catherine's increased spending demands, her emotional distance, and her obvious prioritization of social activities over our marriage created a growing sense that she was no longer invested in our relationship except as a source of financial support for the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. I began to feel like Catherine viewed me more as a provider than as a partner, more as a means to an end than as someone she genuinely loved and wanted to build a future with. Without warning, on a Tuesday evening, Catherine announced that she wanted a divorce. She framed her decision as a realization that we had grown apart over time and that she no longer felt like herself in our marriage. Catherine claimed that we wanted different things from life and that she needed the freedom to pursue her own goals and interests without the constraints of our partnership. I was blindsided by Catherine's announcement, partly because I had been trying to address our problems through increased communication and compromise, and partly because I hadn't realized that Catherine had moved from dissatisfaction to the decision to end our marriage. Despite our recent conflicts about money and lifestyle, I had believed that we could work through our differences and rebuild the connection we had lost. My initial reaction was to suggest counseling, a trial separation, or other interventions that might help us address our problems and save our marriage. But Catherine made it clear that she had already made up her mind and wasn't interested in attempting reconciliation or repair. She wanted a divorce. She wanted it as quickly as possible, and she expected me to cooperate with the process rather than trying to change her mind. Despite my hurt and confusion about Catherine's decision, I committed to handling our divorce with as much fairness as possible. I told Catherine that I wanted her to still be comfortable after our marriage ended, and that I was willing to be generous in our settlement negotiations to ensure that she could maintain a comfortable lifestyle while she transitioned to independence. I even offered to move out of our house and let Catherine continue living there while we worked through the divorce proceedings, thinking that the familiar environment might make the process less stressful for both of us. I had a small apartment that I used occasionally for business purposes, and I was willing to relocate temporarily if it would make Catherine more comfortable during what I knew would be a difficult time for both of us. Catherine seemed pleased by my cooperative attitude and assured me that she wanted our divorce to be as amicable as possible. She expressed appreciation for my willingness to be fair and generous, and she promised that she would approach the process with the same spirit of mutual respect and consideration that I was offering. But within weeks of moving out of our house, I would find out that Catherine had another man move into the house. When I checked Catherine's social media accounts, I found photos and posts that made it clear she was in a serious relationship with someone new, someone who appeared to have been part of her life for significantly longer than the few weeks since she had announced her desire for divorce. The timeline and apparent intimacy of their relationship suggested that Catherine had been involved with this man while we were still married and living together. The final confirmation of Catherine's deception came when I confronted her directly about what I had learned. Catherine's reaction was immediate anger rather than embarrassment or remorse. She told me that I had no right to question how she chose to live her life now that we were separated, and that her personal relationships were none of my business. Most devastatingly, Catherine informed me that the new boyfriend I was talking about would be moving into our house permanently, and that I should adjust my expectations about our divorce settlement accordingly. Catherine seemed to believe that she would be keeping the house and most of our shared assets, and that her new man would essentially be taking my place in the life I had built and paid for. The realization that Catherine had been planning to replace me, not just emotionally, but physically in the home I had worked decades to afford, was like a punch to the gut. I finally understood that Catherine's request for divorce hadn't been about growing apart or finding herself. It had been about making room for someone she preferred while maintaining access to the financial security and lifestyle that my work had provided. Instead of responding to this revelation with the angry confrontation that Catherine seemed to be expecting, I immediately called my attorney and my financial advisor to discuss how to protect my assets and interests during what was clearly going to be a contentious divorce rather than the amicable separation Catherine and I had initially discussed. My attorney and accountant reminded me that the legal structures I had established years earlier would protect most of my assets from Catherine's claims, and that her apparent infidelity would further limit her ability to demand spousal support or a significant share of my wealth. They confirmed that my business interests, investment accounts, and real estate holdings were properly structured to withstand divorce proceedings, and that Catherine's claims would be limited to whatever marital assets we had acquired during our relatively short marriage. Armed with this information, I authorized my attorney to take an aggressive approach to our divorce proceedings, making it clear that I was no longer interested in the generous settlement I had originally offered, and that Catherine's deception and adultery had fundamentally changed my willingness to be accommodating about asset division. During the divorce, I filed detailed financial disclosures that revealed the true nature of my asset protection structures and made it clear that Catherine's assumptions about her entitlement to my wealth were completely unrealistic. The house she was living in was owned by an LLC that predated our marriage. The investment accounts she thought were joint assets were held in trusts that protected them from divorce claims. The business income she had been enjoying was generated by entities that she had no legal claim to. While this legal process was unfolding, I also began systematically cutting off access to services and accounts that were in my name, but that Catherine had been using during our marriage. I canceled streaming services, premium insurance policies, club memberships, and other luxury expenses that I had been covering, but that weren't legally required to continue during our separation. The satisfaction I felt watching as she scrambled to replace these services and adjust to the reality of their actual financial situation was something I hadn't expected, but found deeply gratifying. Catherine had assumed that she could maintain the lifestyle I had provided while replacing me with someone who had no ability to support her in the manner she had become accustomed to. Catherine's reaction to the loss of these financial benefits was immediate and furious. She seemed genuinely shocked that I would cut off financial support for someone who had betrayed our marriage and was actively planning to move another man into the home I had provided. But Catherine's anger turned to genuine panic when she realized that her legal position in our divorce was much weaker than she had assumed. Her attorney had apparently promised her a significant settlement based on the assumption that my assets were vulnerable to divorce claims, and the discovery that most of my wealth was protected by legal structures she hadn't known about completely changed her expectations about the outcome of our proceedings. The legal back and forth continued for 18 months, during which Catherine's relationship with her new man became increasingly strained, maybe as the financial realities of their situation became apparent. The new man had apparently been attracted to Catherine partly because of the lifestyle and financial security that my support had provided, and his enthusiasm for their relationship diminished significantly when it became clear that Catherine would not be receiving the divorce settlement they had both been counting on. According to mutual friends who remained in contact with both of us, her new man's true character became apparent as Catherine's financial prospects diminished. He became generally less supportive and romantic as their relationship shifted from an exciting affair to a practical arrangement with financial constraints. When our divorce was finally finalized, Catherine received a settlement that was legally appropriate, but probably far smaller than what she had expected when she first announced her intention to end our marriage. She kept personal items from our house, received a portion of the savings we had accumulated during our marriage, and was awarded temporary spousal support that would help her transition to independence. But Catherine did not receive the house, did not receive access to my investment accounts or business interests, and did not receive the long-term financial security she had apparently been counting on when she decided to trade me for another man. The legal structures that had protected my assets from business risks had also protected them from her claims, exactly as they had been designed to do. Catherine's final attempt to salvage something from our divorce came in the form of a tearful phone call after she realized that her settlement wouldn't support the lifestyle she had planned to maintain. She apologized for her deception, claimed that she had made a mistake in ending our marriage, and suggested that perhaps we could reconcile and rebuild some sort of relationship. But I had moved far beyond the point where Catherine's regret could undo the damage she had done to our marriage and my trust. I told Catherine that she had made her choice when she decided to leave and be with someone else, and that the consequences of that choice were now her responsibility to manage. The experience of protecting my assets during divorce proceedings confirmed my decision never to marry again, though for different reasons than I had expected after my first wife's death. My first reluctance to remarry had been about emotional vulnerability and the fear of losing someone I loved. My current reluctance was about financial vulnerability and the recognition that marriage created legal obligations and risks that could threaten everything I had worked to build. I realized that if I hadn't structured my assets properly before marrying Catherine, I would have lost approximately half of everything I owned to someone who had betrayed our marriage and planned to replace me with another man. This understanding fundamentally changed my approach to relationships and financial planning going forward. I could continue to build wealth, enjoy the fruits of my labor, and even have meaningful relationships with women who shared my interests and values. But I would never again legally marry another woman. The months following my divorce allowed me to refocus on the activities and interests that had been neglected during my marriage. I threw myself back into my business with renewed energy, expanding into new markets and exciting investment opportunities. The combination of renewed focus on business, physical fitness, and personal interests created a lifestyle that was more fulfilling and authentic than anything I had experienced in my last year of marriage to Catherine. Without the constant stress of trying to satisfy someone whose demands were increasing while her contributions to our partnership were decreasing, I was able to remember who I was as an individual rather than just as half of a couple. I also began reconnecting with friends who had been marginalized during my marriage, as Catherine's social preferences had taken precedence over relationships I had valued for years. These friendships, based on shared interests and genuine affection rather than social status and financial competition, reminded me of what authentic relationships looked like when they weren't distorted by ulterior motives or hidden agendas. 2 years after my divorce from Catherine was finalized, I received occasional updates about her situation through mutual acquaintances, though I wasn't seeking out information about her or remaining involved in her life in any way. According to these reports, Catherine was still adjusting to the financial realities of her new circumstances and had not found another relationship that provided the security and lifestyle she had expected when she left our marriage. Catherine was working full-time for the first time in years, living in housing that was significantly smaller and less luxurious than what she had grown accustomed to during our marriage, and generally experiencing the consequences of her decisions in ways that were both predictable and unavoidable. While I felt no satisfaction in Catherine's struggles, I also felt no guilt about the financial structures that had prevented her from benefiting indefinitely from the work and sacrifices she had never shared. Catherine had made calculated decisions about our marriage based on her assessment of what I could provide for her financially, and she had learned that those calculations were based on incomplete information about my actual vulnerability to her claims. The experience taught me that protecting assets isn't just about being selfish or greedy. It's about ensuring that decades of hard work and careful planning can't be undermined by someone else's poor judgment or hidden agendas. Catherine's betrayal could have destroyed me financially if I hadn't been smart about legal protections, and that realization influenced every subsequent decision I made about relationships, business partnerships, and financial planning. Most importantly, I learned that authentic relationships must be built on mutual contribution and genuine affection rather than financial dependency or lifestyle expectations. Catherine's willingness to trade our marriage for someone who she wasn't sure would provide better financial opportunities had shown me that our relationship had never been based on love and partnership, but on calculation and convenience. I will continue to be open to meaningful relationships with women who share my interests and values, but I approach these connections with a much clearer understanding of what I'm looking for and what I'm willing to risk. The legal protections that saved me during my divorce remain in place, ensuring that any future relationship will be based on genuine compatibility rather than financial calculation. Catherine's decision to bring another man into the home I had provided had shown me exactly how much our marriage had meant to her, and my ability to walk away from that situation with my dignity and assets intact had given me the freedom to build a life based on authenticity rather than obligation. The money that Catherine had expected to inherit from our divorce remained where it belonged, rather than funding someone else's betrayal of the trust one had offered in good faith. Thank you for watching.